This is a refutation of utilitarianism. First, let's clarify the proof of utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill's proof for utilitarianism is often referred to as his proof of the principle of utility, which aims to demonstrate that happiness or pleasure is the ultimate end and foundation of moral principles. Definition of the principle of utility. Mills begins by explaining that utilitarianism is the ethical theory that actions are right insofar as they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Happiness for Mill is pleasure and the absence of pain. Happiness as the ultimate end. Mills argues that every person, when they act, pursues some end goal, whether consciously or unconsciously. He suggests that people naturally aim at achieving happiness and avoiding pain, which is the foundation of all human desires and actions. Premise 1, or Assumption 1, every person desires happiness as the ultimate end. Assumption 2, people desire things for the sake of the happiness they bring. Therefore, happiness is the ultimate end goal that all individuals aim for. The general happiness. Mills then contends that since all people desire happiness, the principle of utility can be generalized to apply to all people, not just the individual. He states that actions are morally right when they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Premise 3. Since all people desire happiness, promoting happiness for all is a rational goal. Premise 4. The greatest happiness for the greatest number is the standard by which actions should be judged. Therefore, the principle of utility is a rational and universal guide for action. 4. The role of justice. Mill also addresses concerns about justice within utilitarianism. He explains that justice is closely... Yep. Oh, wait, okay. The role of justice. Mill also addresses concerns about justice within utilitarianism. He explains that justice is closely tied to the promotion of general happiness. Actions that violate justice, such as harming others, often result in the loss of happiness for individuals or society, thereby contradicting the principle of utility. Oh my god. Premise 5. Justice in its moral sense involves actions that promote the well-being and happiness of all. This is what he's defining justice as. Therefore, the utilitarian principle supports justice as it aims at maximizing happiness. Oh my god. 5. The test of utility. Mill concludes that the ultimate test for the morality of an action is whether it contributes to overall happiness or well-being. Actions are judged by their tendency to promote happiness, with those that contribute more to happiness being morally better. Summary of the proof. People universally seek happiness as the end goal of their actions. Happiness is the only thing inherently good. All other things are valued because they contribute to happiness. The principle of utility, which advocates for the greatest happiness of the greatest number, is rational and aligns with the natural desires of all people. Justice and morality, according to utilitarianism, are about promoting happiness for everyone. In conclusion, Mill's proof rests on the idea that happiness is the only thing people universally desire for its own sake, and therefore actions should be judged by their ability to promote the greatest overall happiness. Okay, so that's basically this whole thing's gonna be me and ChatGPT having a conversation about Mill and the you could say how correct or how true or how reliable is his proof for utilitarianism. So this is me probably speaking, I'm thinking. He appears to be appealing to the commonality in our intuitions in order to argue that we ought to aim for this end. Meaning, because happiness is a common goal for all of us, Mill is arguing that since we all commonly desire happiness as our end goal, then we should base morality out of that, or on that, or from that, whatever word you want to use, they all mean the same thing. So I'm saying that he appears to be appealing to commonality in our intuitions or our beliefs, generally universally shared beliefs, in order to argue that we ought to aim for this end goal of happiness. But he forgets to realize that so many groups have a conditional notion of happiness. A conditional notion meaning it's not just happiness on its own as the end goal, but other things alongside that. So let me just say that again. But he forgets to realize that so many groups have a conditional notion of happiness. By his very logic or principles or rules, each group, due to it being universal that they differ greatly in the type of goals they pursue, that each ought to pursue their own goals, even at the expense of another's happiness. This is as much an inductive proof as Mill's. Call it the reverse utility rule. Both are based on common historical and universal intuitions. Both look at the goals of each group of mankind. Mill disregards that each group differ in how they want to acquire happiness. The homosexual way of acquiring happiness via two men having sex is not approved of by the Christian, for he has his own way of seeking happiness that is irreconcilable with the homosexuals. Does my argument make sense? And is it a proper critique of Mill's inconsistency of appealing to commonality in intuitions? Yes, this is ChatGPT. Your critique of Mill's argument makes sense and is a valid objection to his reasoning. You raise a crucial point that Mill, in appealing to the universality of the desire for happiness, overlooks the fact that different individuals or groups may have radically different conceptions of what constitutes happiness or how to pursue it. This could lead to moral conflicts when people or groups with opposing views on happiness try to impose their ideas of the greatest happiness on others. Here's a more detailed breakdown of your critique. 1. Mill's assumption of a common conception of happiness. Mill assumes that all people by nature desire happiness and that this happiness is fundamentally the same for everyone, pleasure and the absence of pain. However, this overlooks the diversity in how people define happiness. Different cultures, belief systems, and individuals have vastly different conceptions of what constitutes a fulfilling life. For example, as you pointed out, a Christian might find happiness in certain forms of religious devotion or moral conduct, while a homosexual person might find happiness in relationships that are morally condemned by some religious traditions. 2. The reverse utility rule. Your argument that this creates a reverse utility rule is insightful. In your version, the universal intuition that people aim for happiness leads to the conclusion that different groups, each with its own vision of happiness, might pursue their goal even at the expense of others' happiness. Let me say that again. That was a bit weird English. That each with its own vision of happiness might pursue their goals even at the expense of others' happiness. In this sense, each group is rationally justified in following its own definition of happiness, even if it conflicts with other groups. Let me just say this again so it's clear. Basically, I'm trying to say, okay, so if Mill's gonna go with the assumption that the end goal, that it's a common intuition, a common belief throughout all of mankind that we pursue happiness as the end goal, I would say, well, if Mill's being consistent and he's trying to use this universality of human beings in how they pursue goals as a way to figure out how justice is, well, I could just as easily argue that since it's a universal thing with human beings that we pursue happiness even when it causes others suffering, then that should also be part of this sort of guiding rule of rules that we are trying to derive out of our intuitions, our universally shared intuitions. So let me say that again. If basically we're trying to figure out what is justice? Okay, how do we know what justice is? And then Mill is appealing to look at this shared intuition amongst humankind that we all aim as our end goal happiness. So we should use this commonly held intuition. I'll say, okay, if you want to go with this type of logic, well, here's a problem for you. Literally all humans and most of mankind throughout history always pursue happiness, usually at the expense of another portion of mankind. We do this regularly. I think every war is proof of that. Every conflict is because one side wants something and the other side doesn't want that thing. When it comes to even just nowadays, you have a lot of people that know that their government tax money is being used to fuel oppressive wars in the East or the Middle East or something like that. Each group has, up until nowadays, has this common trait where we're willing to pursue happiness even when it causes tremendous suffering to another side or another group or destroys their happiness or prevents their happiness. It's a universal thing. It's always been quite common in human history, in fact. So if Mill is going to be consistent to appealing to universal intuitions, then he should also include this rule, which I call the reverse utility rule, where you basically are allowed to pursue happiness even if it harms other people, because that's quite common and we already do that in various ways. Just look at the clothes that you buy. A lot of these things are from sweatshops and from people suffering in the horrible conditions to make them, work. That's just some of the common ones nowadays. But in the past, like if we're not going to talk about the West, just take human history. We always do this. Just look at so many of the hundreds and thousands of wars that have happened. We commonly were what? Had our own beliefs and customs, each group of mankind, and were imposing on others because that's what made us feel good or happy or we thought was right. Okay? And we did that at the expense of that other group's happiness. That's quite universal. Mankind been doing that for like 24/7 every year for the past who knows how many years we've been on this earth. So I think what's quite clear with what I'm trying to say is that if he's gonna appeal to universal intuitions, he can't just pick and choose. He can't just select one. He has to select all of them. Like, why are you trying to use this universal intuition, let's say, that one of our end goals is happiness, which is, by the way, I'm going to dispute that later, but let's just agree to that for the sake of argument. You're going to use that rule that that this is a common intuition, therefore it's a proof that utilitarianism is true. It's a true describer of justice, of how we should act. But then you just neglect all these other universal intuitions that exist alongside that. That is inconsistent. You can't just claim, universality is a proof for one belief, but all these other beliefs, universal beliefs, are suddenly not a proof now for these other rules. That's inconsistent. You're picking and choosing. What's your guiding rule at that point? You're claiming in one case, yes, if it's universally shit intuitions, it's a proof for it's a proof for whatever ideology you're coming up with. But then somebody else comes with a complete opposite. They give you a complete opposite intuition. Or really, it's not even the opposite. Like it's more like a conditional. How do I describe it? Like somebody saying that happiness is the end goal with every goal we choose. Another person saying happiness is the end goal, but we also do it even when it harms others. This is not really two opposing intuitions. They're more like they're complementary. Actually, they can coexist with each other. Now we all tend to do that. Parents tend to do it with their children. They want something. They'll feel good if their child goes to a school, even if the child hates it, and stuff like that. Like we don't consider the happiness of the child. A lot of parents claim that, but really, it's not a status or just blind following and mimicry of people around and just wanting to fit in that feels a lot of motivations than actually thinking what's best and most happiest for my child to go through. Anyway, the point here is, if you're going to appeal to universal intuitions to prove utilitarianism, then I could just as easily appeal to universal intuitions to appeal or to prove this reverse utilitarianistic rule. And at that point, then, if I can justify that, then, well, anything kind of gets permitted at that point, doesn't it? If I can just justify by saying, oh yeah, you can pursue your own happiness because, hey, it's universally proven that all of us pursue happiness at the expense of other people's happiness, well, then everything's permissible at that point. What's really prohibited at that point? I'll just read that again. In this sense, each group is rationally justified in following its own definition of happiness, even if it conflicts with another group's. This kind of divergence challenges Mill's claim that the greatest happiness is for the greatest number, is a universally applicable principle because it fails to account for the moral pluralism and the cultural relativism that often exists in society. Conflict of values. For example, the homosexuals and the Christians' conflicting views on happiness illustrates this potential moral conflict. If happiness is indeed relative to each group's values and goals, then it becomes much harder to argue that there is one objective set of happiness that all should pursue. Mill's approach might lead to moral contradictions because it doesn't account for the fact that what brings happiness to one group may be perceived as harmful or immoral or disgusting or just doesn't bring happiness to another group, which is quite common, right? Like, humans do not tend to always experience happiness to the same things or routes. Even if you're in the same culture or the same, religion, you could have activities that you find happiness from that others do not. Let alone when you talk about all of mankind with their diversity and contradictory beliefs about right and wrong, theology, and so many other things. Then now the scope of what makes a person happy and not is even wider. So Mill does not account for that at all. Inductive nature of both arguments. You are also correct in suggesting that Mill's utilitarian proof is inductive. It draws on common human experiences and intuitions. But by the same reasoning, your critique also holds an inductive basis, acknowledging that there are diverse conceptions of happiness that arise from historical and cultural differences. Each group's pursuit of happiness might be shaped by its own specific values, customs, and priorities. Thus, your critique suggests that utilitarianism's reliance on shared intuitions does not resolve the issue of how conflicting groups should reconcile their different conceptions of the good life. Conclusion. Your critique highlights a fundamental challenge for Mill's utilitarianism: the assumption that happiness is a universal goal, and that the greatest happiness for the greatest number can be applied universally without considering the pluralism of individual or group conceptions of happiness. You argue that by ignoring this diversity, Mill's utilitarianism fails to adequately address the real-world moral conflicts that arise between people with different values. In essence, your argument is a proper critique of Mill's inconsistency, as it points out that utilitarianism, I feel like this is not clear, but ultimately the inconsistency of Mill is he's appealing to an inductive proof for utilitarianism, but neglecting a equally inductive proof for a reverse utilitarianistic ideology that permits all pursuits of happiness even when it comes at the expense of other people's happiness, which is, again, a very universal thing throughout mankind. From the dawn of mankind, all of us, fighting each other, killing each other, imposing our values upon other groups, we've been doing it for very long. It's quite universally natural that humans have, it's just in our nature to do that type of thing. Even nowadays, just think of all the countries right now that are harming other countries because of value differences or because of resources. It's still common even now. It's not like it's changed. The Western countries still have that bear skeleton still inside of them. So it hasn't changed, I'd say. Just think about, America still giving money to Israel, even when they know that it fuels terrorism or indirectly contributes to, problems in the Middle East and whatnot, and in Palestine. But guess what? Why is America doing that? For its own happiness. It will pursue its own happiness, even at the expense of other groups' happiness. Again, natural, universal. Not that it's good. That's the thing. I'm not agreeing to Mill's entire premise or anything like that, by the way. There are issues with all of this. I'm just saying that if we're going to use its corrupt logic, I could easily justify a reverse corrupt logic here, which pretty much shows that if you're going to go with whatever Mill is saying, you got to go with what I'm saying too, because I have as much proof as he does, historically, psychologically, in my inductive analysis and inductive proof of, common intuitions and what that, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next thing. Also, why a person may feel happy, maybe because of their end goal is, okay, so this is something else. Maybe I should just